John Pollock is a reporter with the Fight Network. So now, John, considering that it has been such a success, why would they want to sell?
I think if you look at the story of the Fertitta brothers and Dana White, what they inherited and bought in 2001, this was a sport that was on death's door, and they were able to take this thing, grow it on cable television, on pay-per-view. They were able to get back into New York. They'll be running a show there in November. They've taken it global. They've cleared just about every hurdle ahead of them, and when you get a $4 billion offer, which is, I think, an astounding figure when you're talking about the same amount of money that the Star Wars franchise was purchased for, I think it's a deal they couldn't say no to. They've accomplished so much, and maybe a deal like this would never come their way again, and they've accomplished an incredible amount in 15 years.
Wow. Now, we talk about in the intro how it used to be considered too violent. Have people's ideas of violence changed that much?
I think that there's two different visions people have of the UFC. There are the early days where I think they look at it as a much darker sport and maybe a fringe sport. And I think that kind of thinking has very much graduated. When you take mixed martial arts at its core and you break down all the different disciplines, boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, for instance, I think the public is largely fine with all that. Amateur wrestling, for instance, and I think putting it all together and surrounding it with a cage, that was a big hiccup for a lot of people. And I think that as time has worn on, people have seen the sport aspect to this and what these athletes do, and it's attracted a big audience, and sponsors are now on board in a very high volume, that the perception has very much changed under Zuffa.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about in Canada? Because I know Georges St-Pierre brought a lot of attention to the sport, but it doesn't seem to have maintained that necessarily, has it?
I would definitely say that the UFC's presence in Canada, it's at a standstill at the moment. Georges St-Pierre not fighting, he's been on the sidelines since 2013, has somewhat halted that. The UFC will be coming back in August to run a card in Vancouver, but also the rest of the world has really caught up with the UFC expanding into so many countries that Canada is not the same priority it was a number of years ago. They came here in 2011, drew 55,000 people at the Rogers Centre, and I think you still have a very healthy audience here in Canada, but they're running all of these shows and they are trying to facilitate a worldwide demand. So yeah, Canada's definitely fallen down, I feel.
Where do you think the buyers are seeing the potential for future?
I think they're looking at a number of key factors. Number one is the ability to break into mainland China and open up that part of the world where that could be a huge revenue stream for them. On top of that, you have a US rights deal coming up at the end of 2018 with their current deal with Fox. And I think they're hoping that this bubble involving sports rights fees continues to grow and grow, looking at the UFC as possibly an underpriced property at the moment. So you put all that together, and unlike other sports, they can take their biggest attractions, biggest cards, and monetize them on pay-per-view, which baseball, basketball, hockey, they can't do that. So there's a very high ceiling, but it's a very volatile industry because you're contingent on stars and you're susceptible to injuries, drug testing. It's definitely a very difficult sport to manipulate.
Yeah, I mean, just as you're mentioning injuries, of course, I'm glancing over and seeing some of these fighting scenes, and it's making me think about, the CFL. They've had so much trouble in football in general with concussions and so forth, and I'm wondering, there isn't right now a union with mixed martial arts, is
No,
there?
That's another interesting element to all of this. When you are a fighter with the UFC and one of the key attractions, a star that's driving a lot of this revenue, you don't share in any of this. When they sign their next television deal anywhere in the world, the athletes are not participating in that either. There is no collective bargaining when Reebok comes on board, for instance. So it's definitely had a big impact on the fighters, and I think that this could be an interesting watershed moment in terms of the fighters looking at this and the value that the UFC has, and they are the product.
So we're almost out of time, but the Fox deal is also almost out of time, right? It ends in 2018?
2 years, yeah. So that's going to be...
And then what?
I think it's going to be... The television landscape, it changes at such a rapid pace, but if you fast forward and ESPN is more aggressive about it and you get a bidding war, I think the UFC could see a gigantic rights fee hike.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here to tell us about it.
My pleasure. Thank you.